Johto, Johto, Johto. I always knew you were a mess, but oh how I loved Generation 2. It introduced so many things to the franchise. A new region, 100 new Pokemon, new places to catch old Pokemon, but even so, there's no denying that Johto might be the most inconsistent region with where its Pokemon are from. As with the other videos in this series, we are going to be looking at the Pokemon that we've been calling Johto Pokemon for years, simply because they first appeared in the Generation 2 games, the games that gave us Johto. But as series veterans know, a lot of these Pokemon aren't actually catchable in Johto at all. Like with Kanto, we can start with some easy ones like the Legendaries and Mythicals. Celebi is almost like Mew in that it's impossible to obtain one without glitching the game. Since Celebi's a time travel Pokemon, I guess it expects you to get in your time machine and head over to a distribution event back at the turn of the millennium. Maybe you can pick one up on your way back from the Mew distribution.
Excuse me? You can actually catch one with the GS Ball event in Japanese Crystal.
Yes, that's true, but I can't find any reliable information that it's still possible to get the GS Ball using the peripherals in Japan, and it's definitely impossible outside of Japan without cheating.
Excuse me? You're forgetting about the 3DS Virtual Console release.
Alright, that's true, but I've got unfortunate news for those of you who don't already own Pokemon Crystal on the Virtual Console. Those games are not available for sale anymore, so that method might not be obtainable to you. If you own Pokemon Crystal on the 3DS, you can get Celebi completely legitimately, no glitches, and you can even transfer it to future generations through Pokemon Bank, but maybe not for much longer. Either way, Celebi has lore-related ties to the Ilex Forest, so it's definitely a Johto Pokemon to me. But like how I kept Mew in the glitch exclusive category in my first video, Celebi might be headed into that category too, at least in Gen 2. They're going extinct, literally. You can't even buy a Gen 2 game that lets you obtain Celebi without glitching anymore, so I think I'd classify them as extinct in the wild. And when Pokemon Bank officially shuts down, it'll only get closer to extinction. But hey, let's move on to some other easy ones with much happier stories. Ho-Oh and Lugia, they've got lore ties to locations in Johto and inhabit those places, so I'm comfortable calling them Johto Legendaries. Same for the legendary dogs, I mean legendary beasts. They've got lore connected to a location in Johto, so these 5 are all quick and easy Johto Pokemon. Like Gen 1's Snorlax, we have another limited Pokemon in Sudowoodo. Now it doesn't really have any lore, or even a good reason for existing in Johto at all. Don't get me wrong, I love Sudowoodo, even though I always end up benching him a few badges in, but there's only one in the entire game. No trainer uses Sudowoodo anywhere in Gen 2, at least going by the trainer list that I found. And most importantly, none of the NPCs even seem to recognize it on the field as a Pokemon at all. And given its shoddy disguise, I think that's an important point. Sudowoodo is definitely not from Johto if nobody there even knows it's a Pokemon. So where's it from? Like many of our Kanto Pokemon, we need to look at Gen 4's Sinnoh. Gen 4 also introduced Bonsly, Sudowoodo's pre-evolution, and both it and Sudowoodo itself are catchable in Sinnoh, so another easy Pokemon to place. Next up, we've got some Pokemon that are easy to place, but really hard to justify. Johto fans and haters know what I'm talking about. It's the Gen 2 Pokemon that are only in Kanto. Murkrow, Houndour, Slugma, Misdreavus, and Larvitar. Before anyone says I forgot Sneasel, it's actually catchable in Johto's Ice Path in Crystal, making it a completely normal Johto Pokemon, and the only dark type that players can catch in the wild before the post-game. Gen 2. I'm going to start with the Johto Pokemon that are exclusive to Mount Silver. First of all, it's pretty cruel for Game Freak to make these new and unique Pokemon exclusive to the post-game at all, but Mount Silver is pretty much the post-game, or at least the end of the post-game. I guess it makes sense for our eventual Mewtwo counter Larvitar to live there. Still wish you could at least get one as a gift or something elsewhere. Anyways, there might be some debate as to whether Mount Silver should count as Johto or Kanto, since it only appears in the Johto games. It's also visible in maps of Johto, which makes it look like it's in Johto. However, I'm going to argue that it's in Kanto for one reason. The route leading up to it is in Kanto, Route 28. This could go either way, so I'll admit that both Larvitar and Misdreavus are borderline Johto Pokemon, since Mount Silver is on the border of Johto and Kanto, but given that they only appear in the post-game, I'm inclined to say that they're from Kanto. If you want to call them Johto Pokemon, that's cool. If you want to exclude them from both regions because they're in the post-game, Misdreavus is actually catchable in a normal area in the Gen 4 remakes of Gold and Silver, suggesting that Misdreavus should be a Johto Pokemon. It's also catchable in Gen 4's Sinnoh, where it got a new evolution evolution. As for Larvitar, I think it can additionally be caught in Gen 6's Kalos before the post-game in Terminus Cave, but I could be wrong. If I am, then we're looking at Gen 7's Diglett's Tunnel in Ultra Sun and Moon of all places. Again, I'm inclined to group them with the other Kanto Pokemon, even though you might consider Mount Silver to be part of Johto, but these next few Pokemon have no excuse. Murkrow, Houndour, and Slugma. As you probably know, Dark-type Pokemon didn't exist in Gen 1's Kanto. There aren't even any Dark-types in the Gen 1 dex at all. The type literally didn't exist before Gen 2. With that in mind, let's focus on Slugma, because Fire types did exist in Gen 1. And no, Slugma isn't a Gen 3 or Hoenn Pokemon. Slugma appear all over Cycling Road in Kanto. Why? Probably to put something interesting to catch there, but that's a gameplay excuse, and I'm not looking for that. Why did they not exist in Gen 1's Kanto, especially when Cycling Road is pretty much unmodified between the two gens? Well, one idea, which I think was first brought up by Just Poka the Epic in the comments on the last video, is that the volcanic eruption on or near Cinnabar Island did something to bring out the Slugma. My guess is that they shot out of the volcano, and enough of them just happened to land all the way over near Cycling Road. Why not Route 21 just south of Pallet Town? Well, gameplay-wise, Route 21 is a lot closer to Cinnabar Island, but going by the game maps, Route 18, south of Cycling Road, is geographically closer. It is possible that they also landed in Route 21, but it was too cold for them there and they didn't survive. Or the Mr. Mime came back home from their Gen 1 vacation and didn't like them there, so they dumped the Slugma into the water. Wait, this is getting a little morbid. They just didn't land in Route 21, okay? So the Slugma landed in Route 18. They couldn't go east because there's Fuchsia City there. They could go north, however, bringing them up Cycling Road and all the way towards Celadon City, but they couldn't spread out any further. Hence, they've found their new habitat in Cycling Road. Now, what makes me think that they came from the volcano at all, aside from a YouTube comment? A very good YouTube comment, I might add. Well, their Gen 2 Silver Pokedex entry mentions that they're a common sight in volcanic areas. There aren't many of those in Johto or Kanto, so that leads me to believe the only explanation is that they got launched out of the Cinnabar volcano like a rocket during the eruption. So given that, I have no qualms calling Slugma a Kanto Pokemon that just didn't exist in the wild in Gen 1. And now we're left with our two dark types. Both Murkrow and Houndour can be found in Route 7, just east of Celadon City, and Murkrow can additionally be found in Route 16, with Slugma at the head of Cycling Road. There's no good reason for them to have appeared in between Gens 1 and 2, at least based on what we know from the games themselves. You might argue that Houndour could have been attracted to the volcanic eruption, I guess, but I think that's a flimsy argument. Well, I'll have you know that I believe I have two less flimsy arguments. The first one revolves around the fact that these Pokemon are both exclusive to the nighttime. Several commenters have brought up the idea that Red, and the player characters in Gen 1, simply never ventured out at nighttime, and thus could never have encountered any nocturnal Pokemon. This ignores how many of us played sessions of Pokemon Red, Blue, or Yellow long enough for the time to have inevitably become nighttime, but that aside, I'd imagine that someone in Kanto should have gone out at night to try to catch some Pokemon, right? Someone should have these Pokemon in their teams, or have been willing to trade them away, or something like that if those Pokemon already lived in Kanto, right? Well, hold that thought. The second argument is that Team Rocket did something weird to mess with the Dark-type Pokemon. I mentioned this fan theory offhand in the last video, where Team Rocket had a bunch of schemes to ensure that Mewtwo is truly the strongest Pokemon. Did Team Rocket hunt Dark types to extinction and hide their existence away from Kanto before Gen 1 happened? Maybe. But I'm actually going to merge these two hypotheses. Team Rocket may have enforced a curfew on Kanto. As you know, there's no day and night cycle in Gen 1, nor is there one in any of the remakes of the Gen 1 games. Since no trainer has a Murkrow or Houndour in Gen 1, that suggests that no one is going out around Route 7 or 16 at night, despite being connected to two of the largest cities in the region. Maybe Team Rocket is the group that's stopping that because they don't want anyone to discover the Dark-type Pokemon on those routes. Of course, that does raise some questions. How do they get the power to enforce a curfew? Why does no one sneak out? Wouldn't anyone see the Pokemon even if they couldn't go out to catch them? I won't dwell on this anymore in this video though. If anyone wants me to do a video doing a deep dive into my take on the whole Team Rocket messes with Kanto to make Mewtwo the strongest thing ever rabbit hole, drop me a comment. But my point is that Murkrow and Houndour are Kanto Pokemon and have been the whole time. Kinda weird to go backwards a generation, but that's where I'm standing. And I think that's about where the list stops being easy to place, and we've still got a couple dozen evolutionary families to cover. Speaking of evolution, let's take a look at some of the Gen 2 Pokemon who are just evolutions of Gen 1 Pokemon. Gen 2 introduced evolutions for some of the most random Pokemon, largely to introduce new type combinations. Can you believe that Bellossom's pure grass type was almost non-existent in Gen 1? In addition to Bellossom, we've got Porygon, Chew, Steelix, Scizor, Politoed, Slowking, and Kingdra. Regardless of the reasons why these evolutions were introduced, we are still left with the bit of a plot hole. Why couldn't we obtain these evolutions in Generation 1? The 5 evolutionary items that affect Gen 1 Pokemon are the Sunstone, Upgrade, Metal Coat, King's Rock, and Dragon Scale. Obviously, none of these items existed in the Gen 1 games, so we couldn't get these Gen 2 evolutions. The question is really, why didn't they exist in Gen 1? The Upgrade is probably the easiest to explain away. It might not have even existed in Gen 1. Silphco may have invented the upgrade for Porygon during the 3-year gap between the two generations, which is plenty of time to add more polygons and to make Porygon rounder. Of course, this doesn't help us figure out where Porygon itself is native to, but since it's a digital Pokemon, it doesn't really make sense to assign it or Porygon 2 as native to anywhere. We can call them Kanto Pokemon because Porygon and Porygon 2 were both designed by Silphco, a Kanto company. The Sunstone, on the other hand, is likely a natural object like the Moonstone. They're only handed out in Johto at the bug catching contest, and there's only one each day the event takes place for the top prize, which suggests that they're in limited quantities. Technically infinite, but not plentiful. They become increasingly common as the series progresses, but are first more readily available attached to Wild Solrock in Gen 3's Hoenn and Underground in Gen 4. Now, Oddish is catchable in both Hoenn and Sinnoh, so I could see the argument that Bellossom should be considered a Hoenn or Sinnoh Pokemon, and in this series of videos that'd make it the first time an earlier Pokemon became native to Hoenn, if I'm remembering right. But since Bellossom's an evolutionary relative of Oddish, I'm kind of inclined to just move Bellossom to Kanto. If the Sunstone can be imported into Johto, there's no reason why it couldn't be imported into Kanto. Maybe they were newly discovered by the time Gen 2 rolled around, but as you can see, things are starting to get messy, and it just gets worse from here. I mean more fun. It gets more fun. This is fun. The Metal Coat is a really fun one, because common knowledge back in the Gen 2 days was that you only got one Metal Coat per game, which meant that you had to choose whether you got Onix or Steelix to keep, kind of like choosing Hitmonchan or Hitmonlee. But you can actually find them infinitely in the Gen 2 games, attached to Wild Magnemite. You can even encounter them in normal parts of Johto, so if you had a super detailed guide and actually taught your Pokemon Thief, or just caught a bunch of Magnemite, you could obtain as many Metal Coats as you wanted. So here, the question becomes, why didn't we take the Metal Coats off of Magnemite in Gen 1 and attach them to the Onix or Scyther to evolve them? Great question! Well, in Gen 1, Pokemon were apparently still being researched. People hadn't realized in Kanto that Pokemon could be holding items at all. So not only did they not know how to attach an item to a Pokemon, they may not have even known that a Magnemite's Metal Coat could be removed at all. Or as an alternative hypothesis, in part of Team Rocket's disruptions, they may have even done something to mess with Magnemite, also explaining why there weren't any Steel types in Gen 1. But let's leave that rabbit hole alone for now. You tell me, why didn't evolutionary hold items work in Gen 1? What's your headcanon? Next up is the Dragon Scale. Conveniently, they're found attached to Wild Horsea and Seadra in Gen 2, in addition to the one found in the Dragon's Den. Both Horsea and Seadra are catchable in Gen 1, but by the time Gen 2 rolls around, there are no Horsea or Seadra to be found in Kanto anymore. So it's possible that the Horsea migrated from Kanto to Johto and picked up some Dragon Scales along the way, or maybe the Kanto Horsea just went extinct because they didn't have any Dragon Scales to make themselves an actual good Pokemon. Sorry, Seadra fans. Finally, we have the King's Rock, which is similar to the Metal Coat in that it's found attached to wild Pokemon that were available in Gen 1, namely Poliwhirl and Slowpoke. Convenient again, isn't it? Another fun item that we thought was limited to just one per game was actually available infinitely this whole time. Ah well. Now, the King's Rock is available as an item in Johto, so sure, maybe there weren't any in Kanto for the Slowpoke to pick up, and Slowpoke actually followed the same pattern as Horsea, seeming to have migrated towards Johto between Gens 1 and 2, so they have an excuse. But Poliwhirl and Poliwag are catchable in Gen 2's Kanto, so there's no excuse there. Unless King's Rocks started popping up into existence between Gens 1 and 2, there's no good explanation for them to not have existed in Kanto. Same with the Metal Coat. So unless we want to accept the no one knew how to use held items idea, then we have to accept that Team Rocket did something to prevent these evolutions from happening in Gen 1. And that's the theory I'm going with on this one. Because remember that Team Rocket takes over the company that makes Pokeballs. Ultimately, what this means is that these new item evolutions are not Johto Pokemon, and are instead native to the region that their pre-evolutions are natively from, as I've decided in the previous videos. But while we're on the topic of new evolutions, let's consider the new happiness evolutions, Crobat, Blissey, and Espeon and Umbreon. Now, some might say that these evolutions weren't discovered simply because nobody willingly used Golbat in Gen 1 and just gave Eevee an evolutionary stone right away. Sure, but Saphia definitely used her Golbat baddie quite a bit for that 4 times damage against grass types in Gen 1, and I made judicious use of my special sweeping Chansey Egg Beam, so they were probably pretty happy members of our teams. Gotta love Gen 1, eh? I'm going back to the Team Rocket theory to rationalize the non-existence of Umbreon with their curfew preventing trainers from leveling up a Happy Eevee at night. Of course, one could ask, why didn't any trainer feed their Happy Eevee a rare candy at night and end up with an Umbreon? Which is fair, so maybe there's more to it than the curfew, especially when trainers logically could have evolved their Eevees into Espeons. Again, Team Rocket took over Silphco, the company that manufactures Pokeballs, and we know that Pokeballs can influence happiness, even as early as Gen 2's Friend Ball, but of course we have the Luxury Ball as perhaps the most frequently used example today. So if we have Pokeballs that can increase happiness, why not Pokeballs that could decrease it? Or lock it permanently below the threshold required for evolution? Now, you may remember that happiness just wasn't a mechanic in Gen 1, with one exception. The starter Pikachu in Pokemon Yellow, who refuses to stay inside the Pokeball. Huh? This whole theory that Team Rocket is responsible for many of the Gen 1 inconsistencies is really starting to shape up, eh? Tell me what you think. Is this sounding plausible? Had you thought of this before? Am I just overthinking weird game mechanics? Well, I know I am, but I'm having fun doing it, and I hope you are too. Either way, that's how I'm going to classify all the happiness evolutions because I can't think of any other reason why they wouldn't be available in Gen 1. So that means that none of these Pokemon are Johto Pokemon either. Espeon and Umbreon go to Kalos with Eevee, not Unova, and Crobat and Blissey are Kanto Pokemon to go with Golbat and Chansey. Even if these evolutions were discovered in Johto first, they would have been native to Kanto if Team Rocket hadn't been messing with the happiness of our Pokemon. But enough evolutions. Let's move on to the gift Pokemon of Gen 2. Aside from the starters, we have Tyrogue, Togepi, Shuckle, and a few Gen 1 Pokemon. And before you ask about the in-game trades, all of them except one have the player receiving a Gen 1 Pokemon, with the single exception being an evolved Johto Pokemon, and that one's only in Crystal. I guess that helps make Gen 2 more consistent than Gen 1, but that's less fun for us. And before I get your hopes up that Shuckle is exciting, I've got to reveal that the gift Pokemon Shucky isn't the only Shuckle in Johto. They are actually catchable by Rock Smash in a few different places throughout the region. I talked about Tyrogue in the last video and offended a few people by calling it a Galar Pokemon. I haven't changed my mind on Tyrogue, but I did find some more evidence to back up my stance that Tyrogue is a Galarian Pokemon. See, its evolutions Hitmonlee and Hitmonchan are not catchable in the wild at all until, guess which generation? Gen 8. They aren't even in raid dens or anything weird, they're just walking around in the overworld like Tyrogue is. And it's the same for its new Gen 2 evolution Hitmontop. It's not unusual for evolved Pokemon to be unavailable in the wild when their pre-evolutions are, but it is weird when the pre-evolution we're talking about is a baby Pokemon like Tyrogue. Usually, the baby Pokemon is only obtainable through breeding, and the base forms, in this case the Hitmons, are found in the wild. Though that's been changing in recent generations, it means we don't have a good explanation for why the entire Hitmon family hasn't been available in the wild until Generation 8. Unless they're native to there. Well, have I brought anyone else over to the Tyrogue is Galarian side of the argument? As for the starters, I won't go through the whole song and dance like I did with the Gen 1 starters. They're nowhere to be found in the wild until Gen 7's Island Scan, Gen 8's Grand Underground, and Gen 9's Terraria, none of which are normal areas in the wild. So the starters aren't really native to anywhere, at least by the definition I've been using. Maybe Let's Go Togepi and Meryl will change that for us? Or what's Gen 2's equivalent to the grass outside of Pallet Town? Is there anything like that in Johto? Now, our last gift Pokemon is probably one of the weirdest ones in Johto. It's so iconically Gen 2, especially since it was introduced early in the anime with Misty's Togepi, which was introduced as a character before Ash even got his 7th Cantonian badge from Cinnabar Island, and more than a year before the Gen 2 games released, even in Japan. And by the way, this is an example of why I'm not counting the anime, because then we'd also have to consider whether Togepi is a Kanto Pokemon, since that's where the egg was found in the anime, and I'm not doing that. So every player can get a Togepi egg, but there are none to be found anywhere else in the game, not even in enemy trainers' teams. Togepi itself could be explained away as being hidden from the wild due to being a baby Pokemon, but its evolution Togetic should be catchable somewhere in the wild, but it's not. Not until Galar, and even then, it's only with a post-game weather condition. That means we have to look at Togepi. Togepi is kind of like Tyrogue. It's only available with Gen 4's Poké Radar and Gen 5's White Forest, neither of which are normal areas in the wild. It's not catchable in a normal area in the wild without any special technology until Generation 8, again with Galar. It's exceptionally rare though, being found in only one area at a 2% chance, and only in certain weather conditions. But thankfully, nothing post-game. So what generation do we assign to Togepi? Well, I could see the argument that since eggs were discovered in Generation 2 and Professor Elm found the egg, we could call it a Johto Pokemon, but since there seems to be only one egg, who knows where he got it from? I think the Togepi egg came from Galar in one way or another, and someone sent it over to famed Pokemon egg and evolution researcher Professor Elm. Speaking of eggs, would Professor Elm have any insight for us regarding Execute? Or do we need a coconut researcher for that Pokemon? Anyways, Togepi was easier than I thought it would be to place in a region, but things are getting weirder again with the other baby Pokemon because they are all linked to Gen 1 Pokemon, some of which I happily called Kanto Pokemon in the previous videos, which introduces the first big question. Are the baby Pokemon Johto Pokemon because they were first discovered in Johto, or Kanto Pokemon when they're part of a Kanto evolutionary family? I could see an argument for either, especially since Professor Elm made the discovery of eggs in Johto. And if Porygon can be a Kanto Pokemon because the Cantonian Silphco invented it, then shouldn't the baby Pokemon be Johtonian in recognition of Professor Elm's discoveries? Or, conversely, for any baby of a Kanto Pokemon, it can be presumed that the babies were just hidden out of the wild by the parents, which would make them Kanto babies of Kanto Pokemon. Of course, I could overcomplicate things, dig deeper in the name of fun, but I'll leave out those baby Pokemon and just place them with their parents for now. So that finally wraps up where all the non-Johto Gen 2 Pokemon are from. This chart thing up here is where I'd place them, though some of them are going to be in multiple spots just because I find the alternate theories so fun. If you disagree with any of them, don't be afraid to tell me. You might know from my last video that I reply to each and every top level comment, even if it takes me some time. As for what's coming next, I do plan on doing a follow-up to the Kanto video to address a lot of the points that were brought up in the comments, and I've been having fun doing these videos, so I do plan on moving forward with the later regions. I think Game Freak generally did a better job of having Pokemon being catchable in the regions they're introduced in starting with Generation 3, but maybe they'll find more ways to, surprise us. Anyways, I'd like to thank you for watching, especially to the end. You are a good person, and I hope you try to be your best each and every day. I hope that I'll see you in the comments, and remember to like and share the video to help get more eyes on it if that's the way you do things. Until next time, have an awesome day and an awesome week.